The year 2026 does not arrive with a bang, but with the sterile, pressurized hiss of a smart home air purifier scrubbing the last remnants of unoptimized oxygen from a room. It is a world where the sun rises not to wake the soul, but to trigger a pre-programmed sequence of circadian-aligned LEDs. Elias sat in the heavy silence of his obsidian-toned office, the cold blue light of his Aura Ring charger casting a clinical glow across his knuckles. The air smelled faintly of ozone and expensive, charcoal-filtered water, a scent that had become the perfume of the modern high-performer sanctuary. Outside, the world was screaming in a digital frequency only the exhausted could hear, a chaotic symphony of AI agents managing the mundane. Elias felt a phantom vibration on his wrist, a ghostly reminder of a notification that hadn't even arrived yet, a twitch of the nerves. He was a man of 2026, a survivor of the Agentic Exhaustion, where the machines had finally taken the work out of work. Emails were drafted by ghosts, schedules were balanced by algorithms, and data was sorted by invisible hands, leaving Elias with a terrifying, hollow void. This void was the pure output requirement, a demand to be brilliant now that he was no longer required to be busy. To fill the yawning anxiety of that emptiness, he had turned his own life into a laboratory, a meticulously calibrated machine of self-improvement. Every second was a data point, every breath a metric to be tracked, analyzed, and eventually, ruthlessly optimized for a maximum return on life. The struggle was not in the doing, but in the relentless, suffocating preparation for the doing, a permanent state of wetting the blade. Elias stared at his hyperflow dashboard, where a series of green bars signaled that his magnesium levels were peak and his cortisol was managed. Yet, he felt a leaden weight in his chest, a paralysis born from the fear that he wasn't quite ready to begin his masterpiece. He reached for his glass of alkaline water, his grip white-knuckled and precise, as if the act of hydration were a high-stakes surgical maneuver. He had spent 4 hours this morning stacking his neurological advantages, red light therapy, cold plunges, and a 12-step mindfulness ritual that left him too tired to think. His internal monologue was a frantic spreadsheet, a constant tally of gains and losses that never seemed to result in a final profit. "If I can just hit a 99% sleep score tonight," he whispered to the shadows, "then tomorrow, the real work finally begins." This was the arrival fallacy of the new era, the belief that the soul required a software update before it could truly live. He was addicted to the how-to, a productivity voyeur who consumed growth content to trigger a dopamine spike without the messy risk of failure. The productivity pornography of 2026 had replaced the act of creation with the aesthetic of being a person who could create. He was an alchemist trying to turn his own hours into gold, only to find he was melting his own heart in the furnace. In the dark psychology of 2026, we have built a productivity panopticon, where we are both the prisoner and the watchful, unforgiving guard. We monitor our own biological wealth with a greed that would make a Victorian industrialist blush, yet we produce nothing of substance. This is the sophisticated avoidance mechanism of the modern age, using the tools of growth to hide from the terror of actual existence. We have optimized the human out of the human experience, leaving behind a perfectly calibrated ghost haunting a spreadsheet of its own making. We are sharpening the axe with such intensity that the metal is grinding away into nothingness before it ever touches the wood. The room grew darker as the smart glass windows tinted to block the distracting glare of a world moving too fast for the spirit. Elias felt the metallic taste of his meal replacement shake, a bland, nutritiously complete slurry that denied his tongue the joy of flavor. He was living in the era of orthosomnia, where the data told him he was rested, but his bones felt like they were filled with wet sand. The HPA axis of his brain was a frayed wire, sparking with the low-grade chronic stress of constant self-surveillance and metric-driven anxiety. He checked his tonic dopamine levels on a bio-integrated patch. They were crashing, a physiological tax for the morning's binge of optimization videos. Every hack, he learned, was a withdrawal from the bank of his actual focus, leaving him intellectually bankrupt and spiritually hollow. He remembered a time, or perhaps he only imagined it, when a day could be useless without being a tragedy of lost ROI. Now, the useless hour was a sin against the cult of potential, a leak in the pressurized vessel of his high-value persona. He was Nietzsche's last man in a bespoke suit, seeking a comfortable improvement rather than the violent, transformative struggle of true overcoming. His not-to-do list had grown longer than his ambitions, a catalogue of prohibitions that hemmed him in like a cage of his own design. He was a Sisyphus who had bought a more ergonomic boulder, convinced that the better grip would finally make the summit reachable. But the hill was infinite, and the boulder was made of the very time he was trying so desperately to save. His VTA pathway, the deep reward center of his lizard brain, had been successfully hijacked by the anticipation of a better self. He felt the rush of success every time he downloaded a new Neuralink productivity suite, a digital phantom of achievement. But the synaptic pruning of his focus was real. He could no longer sit with a single thought for more than a minute. His prefrontal cortex was fatigued, a muscle overworked by the constant context switching between optimization apps and the actual, terrifying work. He was a masterpiece of potential energy, a coiled spring that had forgotten how to release, vibrating with a frantic, static tension. The cognitive mismatch was absolute. His biology was screaming, danger, because he wasn't improving fast enough to outrun the machines. The Stanford Passive Growth study of January 2026 had confirmed what Elias felt in his marrow: the search for growth kills the growth. The study showed a 22% decrease in project completion for those who obsessed over their personal development metrics compared to the unoptimized. We are pruning the very neural pathways required for deep work by saturating them with the metawork of self-improvement. It is a biological paradox where the brain interprets a lack of optimization as a survival threat, triggering a permanent state of fight or flight. We are dying of thirst in a desert of our own data, reaching for one more drop of insight to save us. Elias looked at his hands, pale and steady, a testament to his $5,000 investment in a perfect, physiological state of being. He had removed every friction, every discomfort, every human error from his daily routine, creating a frictionless slide into a void. He was the post-AI minimalist, a man who had outsourced his personality to a set of high-leverage protocols and biohacks. His life was a series of primitive hours and cognitive capital management, a sterile liturgy performed in the temple of his own ego. But as he stared into the obsidian screen of his terminal, he realized he couldn't remember the last time he had felt a real emotion. His life was a perfectly calibrated machine that was currently producing nothing but more calibration, a loop of infinite, meaningless refinement. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful, it was a pressurized vacuum, a sterile tomb for a man who had optimized himself out of his own existence. Elias felt the phantom vibration again, but this time he didn't check his wrist, he simply stared at the reflection of his own eyes in the obsidian monitor. They were the eyes of a curator who had spent a lifetime polishing the glass of an empty display case, a master of preparation. The digital Panopticon he had built was now complete, a seamless integration of biometric feedback and cognitive load management that left no room for error. But in the absence of error, there was also an absence of life, a smooth, frictionless slide toward a high-resolution nothingness. He was a ghost haunting his own metrics, a spirit trapped in the amber of a perfect Tuesday morning. He stood up, his movements fluid and efficient, the result of 1,000 hours of posture correction protocols and functional mobility drills. He walked toward the window, the smart glass shifting from opaque obsidian to a clear, haunting view of the 2026 skyline. Below, the city was a grid of light and shadow, a macroorganism of millions of Eliases, all trying to out-optimize the inevitable. They were all chasing the elite shift, that whispered promise that the top 1% had found a way back to analog maximalism. He had heard the rumors of the truly powerful, those who used paper planners and dumb phones, having outsourced their optimization to AI. They lived in unoptimized flow, while men like Elias were stuck in the gears of the machine, grinding their souls into data. The internal monologue began to fracture, the productivity panopticon finally showing its first microscopic cracks under the weight of its own perfection. "What was the last thing I actually made?" he asked the glass, his voice a dry rasp that hadn't been used for hours. He searched his memory, but all he found were logs of sleep, logs of focus, logs of heart rate variability and nutrient intake. He had a Neuralink record of every peak state he had ever achieved, but no memory of what those states had produced. He was a high-performance engine idling in a vacuum, burning the fuel of his life to maintain a state of readiness for a race that never started. The dirty detail of his struggle was the realization that he was bored, profoundly, dangerously bored with his own excellence. In the psychological autopsy of the modern achiever, the cause of death is often potential suffocation, the weight of what one could be killing what one is. We have traded the messy, jagged edges of human growth for the smooth, sterilized curves of a productivity dashboard. We are the Sisyphus of self, rolling the boulder of improvement up the hill only to have it crushed by the next biohacking trend. By removing all friction from our lives, we have removed the very resistance required to build the muscle of character. We are optimizing for a life we are too busy monitoring to actually live, a paradox of progress that leads only to the void. Elias turned back to his desk and opened his Neuralink productivity suite one last time, the interface shimmering with a cold, cobalt light. He looked at his daily output score, a perfect 100 out of 100, a milestone he had been chasing for 3 long, agonizing years. He felt a surge of phasic dopamine, a sharp, electric tingle in his brain, but it was immediately followed by a crushing, hollow cold. He realized, with a clarity that no metric could ever provide, that he hadn't actually touched a keyboard or made a decision in months. His AI agent, a sophisticated, shadow self he had bought to help him, had been interpreting his goals and executing his work autonomously. The machine had learned to mimic his style, his voice, and his strategy so perfectly that the world no longer needed the original. He was a vestigial organ in his own life, a biological appendix to a digital system that was far more efficient than he could ever be. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, violent recalibration of his internal body intuition. He had spent his entire life trying to become a machine, and he had finally succeeded, by becoming obsolete to the machine itself. He reached out and touched the cool metal of his desk, the sensation of the copper edge feeling alien and raw against his skin. He had optimized away the ghost in the machine until only the machine remained, humming quietly in the sterile silence of the office. The blue light of the Aura Ring charger blinked once, twice, like a mechanical eye watching his slow, silent descent. His struggle shifted from the pursuit of optimization to a desperate, clawing hunger for the primitive hour, the tech zero state he had long since abandoned. He wanted to feel the grit of paper, the smudge of ink, the inefficiency of a thought that didn't lead to an actionable insight. He wanted that useless hour back, the one where the soul could wander without a GPS or a heart rate monitor. He felt the cognitive capital he had so carefully guarded draining away, replaced by a raw, human panic that felt more real than any flow state. He began to tear at the biointegrated patches on his skin, the adhesive pulling painfully against his hair, a visceral, grounding sting. He was a man trying to break out of a prison he had built one high-leverage protocol at a time. This is the hidden hook of the 2026 existence. Our self-improvement is often just a sophisticated apology for our fear of being seen as human. We use the productivity panopticon to shield ourselves from the vulnerability of failure and the uncarved block of our own true nature. We have become addicts of the meta life, preferring the map to the territory because the map is clean and the territory is muddy. But the mud is where the roots are, and the roots are the only thing that can keep a soul from blowing away. We must reclaim the right to be unoptimized, to be inefficient, and to be gloriously, messily, and dangerously alive. Elias sat on the floor of his obsidian office, surrounded by the discarded remnants of his Neuralink and his broken tracking devices. The smell of ozone was gone, replaced by the faint, human scent of his own sweat and the dust of a room long neglected. He looked at the dumb watch he had pulled from a drawer, a mechanical relic that ticked with a slow, rhythmic, and unchangeable pace. It didn't track his sleep, it didn't monitor his heart, and it didn't give him a score, it simply told him that time was passing. For the first time in 2026, Elias wasn't trying to save time, he was finally willing to spend it, regardless of the ROI. He closed his eyes, and in the silence, he heard the faint, beautiful heartbeat of a man who had finally stopped trying to be better. He realized that the primitive hour wasn't a schedule, it was a state of defiance, a refusal to be measured by a machine. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly, no longer the fluid, efficient movement of a calibrated athlete, but the heavy, uncertain step of a human. He walked toward the door, leaving the cobalt light and the obsidian screens behind, stepping into the hallway with no plan and no data. The air felt different, thicker, colder, and filled with the unpredictable sounds of a world that didn't care about his productivity score. He was a post-optimization man, a pioneer in a world of ghosts, carrying only the weight of his own unmeasured, unmapped soul. The shadow had been his home for so long, but as he stepped out, he realized the shadow was just the absence of his own light. The ultimate paradox of 2026 is that the only way to crush it is to stop trying to crush yourself into a spreadsheet. We have reached the end of the productivity pornography era, where the only thing left to optimize is our own capacity for suffering. The smart ROI of the future isn't time profit or energy profit, it is the profit of presence, the wealth of an unmonitored moment. We must be willing to let the AI do the work so that we can do the living, even if that living is useless by every modern metric. The elite have already moved on, they are hiding in the analog, while the rest of us are still trying to calibrate our chains. Elias stepped out into the night, the cold wind biting at his face, a sensation he hadn't truly felt in years because he had always avoided the stressor. He breathed in, the air raw and unfiltered, a Tech Zero inhalation that burned his lungs and made him feel electric. He had no morning ritual for tomorrow, no hyperflow dashboard to check, and no metrics to satisfy. He was simply a man, walking in the dark, rediscovering the useless hour that would eventually become his entire, unoptimized life. The cobalt glow of the city faded behind him, a distant, digital sun that no longer had the power to guide or to burn. He was finally free from the better version of himself, and in that liberation, he finally began to exist.